This lesson we're going to be looking at how we can create objects in JavaScript, both the literal and also the constructed method, the differences between the two, how we can get values from the object so it can contain different data types and then return those values within the code. Also within the naming of the property, using the name, if we use the quotes, we can have a space within the name, but then we need to return it using the bracket notation instead of the dot notation. And some of the flexibility when we use the bracket notation, since it's expecting a string within the property name, and this way we can return it back. And if we can have a dynamic value that's incrementing and it matches with what our property names are, then we can return back the values that are associated with it. There's also how you can use a method within the object using the keyword of this, and how it's not going to work if you use the arrow format, and the differences of how you can select this referencing the parent object, and if there are any changes to the object, how it's going to be reflected in the output when you are invoking the function. Let's go ahead and create an array. In the earlier lessons we have been looking at arrays, and we'll use the console log and then get the type of the array. And what it's going to return back is that the array is actually an object. So an object represents a data type in JavaScript, and that also includes arrays. So arrays are objects, but they have their own set of properties and methods that you can use and to make use of the content that's contained within the array. So objects can be created, and we can also create objects separately as they can contain their own set of values. So we've got an object constructor in JavaScript, and objects are represented with the curly brackets. So let's go ahead and we're going to create a couple objects. And these are the object that contain multiple values contained within them and using the curly brackets. And let's add in an object. So an object has values that, so we can set up a blank object with the curly brackets, and we can also use the object constructor in order to make a new object. So we're going to go ahead and create an object, and then we'll use those objects and output the results of the object into the console log so we can see what's contained within these objects. So both objects are created, they're both blank. You can also create objects with properties. So if we added in to the object, so once we have the object created, we can add to it either using the dot notation or the bracket notation. So let's select the object 1, and this is going to be just using the dot notation. So we'll create a new object with the property name of first, assign a value, and do the same for the object 2. So this adds in a value that's contained within the object. And we can see that it's got a property name of first and references the value of Laurence. So just as we set these values, we can also return them the same way. And that's again using the bracket or the dot notation. So if we want to reference the item with the property name of first, we can return those values out of the object. So there's also a way to create them using the bracket notation. So it's going to contain a string value for the property name and using a bracket notation in order to set those values. So I'm going to set this up as last. That's adding another item into the object with the first and last. When you are creating the object, the easiest way is just to use the curly brackets, and you can also add in the values as the name pair values when you are creating the object. Add some values into the object, so use those same named pair values where we've got the key, which is first, in order to access the value, and then the actual value itself. So in this case, it's going to be a string value. You can have different data types as well as what we saw. So let's create a few more items into the object. So another string. You could have a number. So if we had an ID, you can also have a Boolean value. You can also have an array, so returning back all of those values. So we've got a fairly complex object where we've got courses, the first, the ID, last, member. If you reuse the property name when you're setting a value, so if we use ID again, but this time we set it to 5,000, there can only be one key with these are all going to be unique names for the keys. So if you reuse it, what it does is it just reassigns it. And also there's no particular order for the values. It's just going to sort it and it's going to return it back alphabetically. So you're not going to have whatever order you've set where you've got the static order like the arrays with all the index values. These are all going to be ordered. And within this, when we're outputting into the console, this is going to be alphabetically ordered. You can also have an object within an object. So set a few values within the object. So we do have an object that's nested within an object, and you can have arrays nested within those objects and so on and so on. So in order to retrieve back some of the values from the object, let's take a look at what we've got for first, last, ID, member. So these ones are relatively easy where we could just use the name. So if we want to return back ID, we can output the ID that way. You can use either the dot notation or the bracket notation. There's also for the object, if we want to return back the array, that's going to return back the array of courses. And just as we saw in the earlier lessons, in order to select the item from the array, we can use the index value. So now that we've got the array selected, we can then at that point select the value. So if we want to return back JavaScript, that's going to have a value of index 0. So that's going to return back that result. And in order to retrieve back the object properties, we can return back the object. And then if we want to select the items from the object, we would use their values and just separate them with the dots. So that will return back a value of 10 that's contained within the object. So JavaScript objects, you can set it as you would with JSON as well. So with JSON, there are some certain set of rules. So it's based on JavaScript objects, so they're not entirely JavaScript objects. And with JSON, you do need to have the double quotes for the property names and also for the values. So this would be with creating the object within a JSON type structure. And it's going to work the same way. Also within the object, when you are creating objects, if you are using the quotes around the string, you could separate out the property name, and that gives us some more flexibility with the naming, so we can have spaces. So unlike variables where we can't have spaces, when we are using the quotes, we can have a space within the key name. This represents only one way that we can actually return back that value. Since we can't use the dot notation in order to reference that value, we have to use the bracket notation in this instance. Using the bracket notation, there are some benefits to that as well. So let's create another object. And if we had a set of key names for this object that we're incrementing, such as ID1, and there's different ways to iterate through the objects, more of those later on in the upcoming lessons. But just as an example of how we can select these values, and we know the iterator, so ID is the string value, we're incrementing it by 1. So if we created a for loop where we set the value of I to be 1 and we loop through while I was less than 4, we increment I by 1. So now we can have a more dynamic value that's outputting those values from that particular object. So using the dot notation, we're fairly static with what we can provide, but using the bracket notation, this gives us more flexibility because it's expecting a string value. So we can have in an ID, and then we can concatenate whatever the current value of I is as we're iterating through, and that will return back the associated value to those key values. Objects in JavaScript can also contain methods. So let's go ahead and create another object, and this object is going to contain a method, and the method can reference the object properties that are contained within that method by using the this keyword. So some string values, and in order to return back the full name, we can have a function here, and this function can then be run, and it can reference some of the values that are contained within the object itself. And this is where we can use the keyword this. So if we want to get the first and return that back as a string value, so I'm using the template literals, which are the backticks, in order to wrap and create the string. So use this last. And let's try that out. Within the console, listing out the object 7, it's going to return back the object with its function. And now in order to use the function, we can use object 7 and call the function. So if we use full by itself, it's going to return the function on its own. So that's where you need to use the rounded brackets in order to invoke the function and return back the value that's associated with it. Also, if you are using the arrow format, so if you were to use the function within the arrow format, you can still create the anonymous function with the arrow format. But the difference is that you can't use the keyword this. So this is no longer going to be referencing the object itself. You can, however, use the object name in order to reference the values contained within the object. So that way you can still return it back. But I do suggest that if you are trying to use the keyword this, use the function keyword instead of the arrow format in order to create the function, because this way it's a lot cleaner of code if there are any updates to that property name. So if you change your last name, that will now be reflected within the output directly. And the same thing here, where we're still referencing that parent object, and that still allows us to return the updated values of the object if we do make some updates to it, but it's not as clean as using the keyword this, where it's just referencing whatever the current object parent is and then using the property name in order to turn back the value that's contained within it. If you are using functions, this is not going to be valid JSON, since JSON cannot run functions. When we do use the keyword this refers to an object. So if we're using the keyword this and there's no object, it's going to look to the global scope for those values. So in this case, if we're using this, it's going to look for the scope outside of the object in order to turn back a value for first. And the reason that it works over here within the object 7, the object is being referred to as the parent within the parent scope. So any of these property names can then be used in conjunction with this. Go ahead and try it out to become more familiar with creating objects in JavaScript.